is another one of my videos on Alistair Parker's introduction to the Second World War, this one on strategic bombing. It comes from chapter 10, which is quite a long chapter, so I've subdivided it into a number of separate sections. So talking about the impact of bombing in general, the Allied bombing compelled the Germans to devote and concentrate more resources on defense. Already in the spring of 1944, the American Air Force was battling the German fighters and making it impossible for the Germans to challenge Allied air supremacy during the invasion of Normandy. German anti-aircraft units required the diversion of large numbers of men from the battlefronts, though probably not of the highest quality. They also diverted a large number of the 88mm guns from alternative use as field artillery, particularly damaging as they were the most effective anti-tank gun of the war. Bombing affected civilian morale far less than had been predicted by pre-war strategists. They had assumed that it would reduce or destroy support for the war, and so put irresistible pressure on governments to make peace on any terms, or at least make civilians less willing or able to work productively to win the war. Loss of civilian morale would in turn lead to an erosion of the armed forces' willingness to risk death and injury. In practice, however, whilst bombing brought death and injury to some, and misery to those who were emotionally attached to its victims, the numbers killed were initially relatively few, and it sometimes even raised morale. Buildings suffered far more, particularly if they were lightly built, and homelessness was a major consequence of bombing raids. For example, the massive bombing raid on Hamburg killed just over 3% of its population, but made 48% of its dwellings uninhabitable. In Kobe, Japan, only 1% of the population was killed, but over half its homes were destroyed. Factories were also burnt or collapsed, but machinery inside them often remained in good working order. Homelessness might be temporary or permanent, but survivors rarely suffered from complete mental collapse. Air raids produced fear and stress, but this was generally transient and spasmodic. Common depressive reactions, apathy, lethargy, gloominess, excessive docility, didn't necessarily stop people from carrying on with their daily tasks. Even minor coronary and stomach disorders, for example peptic ulcers, which commonly followed air raids, were only intermittently disabling. Studies in Britain showed that those who had been bombed out returned to work, on average 6 days after losing their homes. The destruction of housing increased the numbers of people living in a house, as some of the homeless found new roofs under which to shelter, although those who were unemployed, mothers, children, the aged, were ready to be evacuated, reducing the pressure on occupancy in the towns. Even when fear impelled townsfolk to trek into the surrounding countryside each night for safety, they turned up for work next day. Hardship and stress didn't reduce their need for the regular wages on which they depended. Apathy towards the war and public affairs, conviction of eventual defeat, and even deep despair didn't necessarily reduce an individual's contribution to the war effort. After the war, one young German mother recalled that it was simply one's duty to work, and she was not accustomed to not working. She was often tired out with the war, but she needed the money, and not working anyway was forbidden. Governments discouraged dissent through censorship and repression. The impact of bombing on morale was influenced by the energy and competence of the local administration. Rapid response by firefighters, rescue workers, and ambulance and hospital staff, effective food distribution, speedy removal of the dead, rehousing, the supply of clothing and bedding all helped prevent resentment against the authorities, whilst their breakdown or absence diverted anger from towards the enemy towards the government. German measures were well administered. Those in Britain varied between towns. Ineffective local government in Coventry made victims of attack feel demoralized, unlike the effective measures taken in London. Morale amongst those who lived through air raids unharmed could be enhanced with a shared sense of pride and a greater identification with the nation at war. Shared danger brought people together, providing reassurance and turning urban agglomerations into communities. Shy and lonely people could find their neighbors approachable and themselves needed and valued. Suicides became less common. Bombs broke down social barriers, and the indiscriminate nature of the attacks reduced resentment towards the rich and the privileged. In London, where the poorer districts were more subject to bombing, the government sought to reassure people with royal visits, ministerial tours, and news of bombs being dropped on Whitehall or near Buckingham Palace. When communal spirit grew and suffering was blamed on ferocious enemies, as in both Britain and Germany, it strengthened morale. In Japan, however, as we'll see in the next video, civilian morale was greatly diminished by bombing, with the result that influential individuals, headed by the emperor himself, forced the military to surrender, when many of them thought that it was more honourable to prefer death for themselves and others. So that's all I'll say for now. Thank you very much for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without whom I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You're very welcome to support my channel if you wish. Please do like, comment and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week we'll finish off this chapter on strategic bombing with a discussion of the bombing of Japan. Have a good day.